Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe, and joining us today is an author making their debut here on the show. Now, my guest today believes that the pen is mightier than the sword, and asks you kindly don't tell Excalibur that he said this. Perils of the Past is his debut fast-paced fantasy novel, which was published May 23rd, 2025. And for the draft manuscript, it was a 2023 Killer Nashville Claymore Award finalist for Best Sci-Fi and Fantasy. He has also penned flash fiction and short stories. His flash fiction piece, Rise and Ice, won a competition held by Press 53 and was featured in Prime Number magazine, as well as in the anthology What Dwells Between the Lines. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to our guest, author Mr. Kane Williams. Kane, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. This is awesome.
Awesome, Kane. Awesome. I'm so excited to have you here and really intrigued to learn about your book, Perils of the Past. Now, without spoiling it too much for those that have not picked up the book, what can you tell us about your novel?
Of course. So, Perils of the Past, let me hold it up, is my debut. Came out in May this year, so it's only a couple of months in. It is a standalone, so there's no series to it. Standalone novel. It follows a young woman on a desperate journey to find a cure to save those she cares most about. That's in one line. That would be how I'd summarize it. It draws inspiration from my love of action movies and my deep enjoyment of fantasy novels, especially action adventure type things. So it's been compared to, for example, The Hobbit.
Ooh.
I would probably compare it to, say, The Art of Prophecy by Wesley Chu, or maybe In the Shadow of Lightning by Brian McKellen.
Nice, very nice. I'll have to check out those books after the interview, but I'm really excited to have you here, Kane. I've had a chance to look at your socials and your profile, and you are definitely, a person that is very passionate about the written word, telling stories, sharing your stories with others. It is simply incredible. So before
Really
we
appreciate
talk,
that.
you're welcome. So, before we dive further into the overall construction of your book, let's talk a little bit more about you, Kane, as an author and, of course, a person. So, were you always a creative person growing up, or would you say there was a definitive aha moment that really put you on the path of being an author?
I've always loved this question that you ask. So I think there's a few different elements to it. One is that I've always been a reader. I grew up, and my mother was a primary school teacher, but also a librarian. My father was just a born storyteller. Like, he was always like, you went fishing and the fish wasn't this big. The fish is like, it's this big, right? And so I grew up in that kind of household, and I grew up just, devouring books. And with that kind of attitude and environment, I found myself kind of wanting to write, and that I enjoyed, penning short stories and making stories up, and that you get those dreams as a 12-year-old of writing your own book, and that it would be that type of book that you were enjoying at that time. So at the time, I was loving two different stories. I was loving
Mm.
my top two books. If you ask, like, me in grade 6, I would tell you that Ice Station by Matthew Riley, is an amazing Australian author who writes books that are so cinematic that it's almost too expensive to produce at the movies. Like, there's just too many explosions. They're just too fast sweeping. They're really fast paced. So Ice Station by Matthew Riley, and then The Hobbit by the one and only J.R.R. Tolkien. And so the book that I always wanted and dreamed about writing was a combination of the two, like definitely a fantasy novel, always a fantasy novel, inventive, unique, fast-paced, with an epic scale like adventure. On the other side, that it needed those fight scenes, chase scenes. I mean, the favorite thing probably about Matthew Riley's novels is that the main character, you start to fear for their life so much that they've been shot in the chest, like from point blank range, and you're like, there is no way you can survive that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Except there's some little clue back in chapter 2 about how he was. It's not as obvious as he was wearing a bulletproof vest. Maybe he tampered with that gun in that 2 seconds that he had. Maybe he swapped out whatever it is, right? But there's always that point where he ends up kind of turning it around, and you've been really worried about said character there. You're sure they're going to die, although you're not, because it's a Matthew Riley novel. And then that he ends up saving the day. So the combination of kind of like a Matthew Riley ice station with The Hobbit, and that was a dream as a 12-year-old, and that was the dream that about 4 years ago, like I'd tinkered with this novel since I was, I don't know, 16, and started to pen some stuff on Christmas holidays, but I got serious 4 years ago, and wrote 6 days a week from then.
Nice, amazing. So now let's actually dive into the creation of your debut novel. So let's start at the beginning, and this is just a good little fan question. So for you, Kane, are you an author that is a planner or a pantser, spontaneous?
Yeah. So plotter or pantser, I'm far more towards the plotter stage, but not that every scene is written out, not the kind of intimate level of detail that some, like there's no 20,000 word outline. There is a world building document. There is a document setting out 10 or so key scenes, and then I've got ideas for a bunch of them. So I found it useful. Like every writer will find their own way, and I'm definitely a believer in that. Each writer will have a different style that works for them. I don't think there's any right answer to these type of questions or one way to write a book. But for me, I found it very useful to know where I was heading, to know like, oh, I'm halfway through on my outline. That kind of means I'm halfway through on my book. That's really exciting. And I'm sitting at 60,000 words. That's perfect. Like, if I was sitting at 30, that'd be a cause for concern. I'm writing an epic fantasy book, and you need some thickness to it at the same time, but you don't need I'm not writing a doorstop of 300,000 for my first one. That might be a little intimidating to some. So yeah, I found it useful to know where I was heading, but I also enjoyed having a bit of freedom when I got to that chapter of like, I've got 5 dot points for 4,000 words, right?
Right.
So I still had that freedom to explore how that character got from A to B, or some of them I didn't quite know how they were going to win that fight scene, or how they were going to survive that beast that's in the novel. So yeah, it was that right mix, but I definitely needed that outline to help me kind of keep in the one direction.
All right. And you mentioned earlier that when you began writing your debut novel, you wrote 6 days a week. Would you consider that a ritual, a routine, or something that you just did that eventually became one of those two?
Yeah. So it was through a process of experimentation where I found out what kind of worked for me. And so I found that, I mean, the most time with a very kind of demanding day job, Monday to Friday was quite difficult. But I found that if I wrote on, Saturday and Sunday one weekend, and then I put it down for a week, and then I came back to it, I was losing some of the flow. I was having to like trace back my steps and then kind of re-immerse myself back into that scene and then start again. So I actually found that, a week gap between my writing wasn't very productive. It wasn't the best way for me to write. And then also there's only so much writing that you can jam into a weekend. So I knew I needed more. I experimented with writing after work, and full credit to everyone that can write after work. I found it really difficult. My creativity wasn't flowing as well as it could have. It was a struggle, and I was mentally tired after, working, however many hours that day. And so I found that I used to exercise more in the morning and then write at night. I found swapping those, if I prioritize the writing, and that if I, wake up when I'm nice and fresh, dive into the writing, even if it's 45 minutes, even if, 45 minutes or an hour from, say 6 a.m. to 7 a.m., then if I can do that, that really, that's 5 hours if I do that. And then I can write, 5-10 hours on a weekend. That's definitely sufficient to keep this story moving. And I've definitely found that writing with fewer gaps in between worked for me, with the consistency, the momentum, but also it just kept it really fresh. And when you're trying to weave together different storylines at different paces, so this novel, Perils of the Past, includes 3 point of view characters, and so trying to weave together their tales, and with this type of story, which is action adventure but also mystery, where you've got red herrings and where you've got elements of deception and where you're subtly building the world out, I found that I needed that kind of concentrated period. Yeah.
All right. That's actually very true. For me, I'm kind of a little bit of the opposite. I edit my past stories during the day. And for me, I like to write in the evening when I get off work. And sometimes I write right after I do my workout. So it's like around 9 o'clock to like 11. I get like 2 hours, about, I want to say, 5 days a week, give or take, depending on how I'm feeling after the day. But yeah, it is very true that, there's not really a set in stone routine that works best for all authors. It's just depending on, okay, how committed are you to, finishing this story? What's the goal you have for yourself? And do you want to meet that goal? And that leads to the next question is, for Perils of the Past, ultimately when you found your rhythm and you figured out, okay, this works for me in terms of like, getting the creative juices flowing, what was sort of your goal as the author with this book, as well as the promise making to fans of the genre?
Yeah. So those answers overlap almost entirely in my mind. So I've written the type of book that I love to read. I've talked about how it's packed with action. By that, I'm meaning sword fights. By that, I'm meaning mages having epic, magical battles. I'm talking about beasts. While I do love, the Lord of the Rings, say, with the gigantic armies kind of clashing on the battlefield, I wanted something more intimate, more personable for this one. And so I set out to have smaller scale battles. So the largest might be like, 20 people on 20 people, for example, in a quite a secluded location. So that's the action side. I knew that I wanted to deliver a unique world. Like that's one of my favorite things about fantasy. And so this unique world has a couple of different things about it. One of them would be that humans are not at the top of the food chain. Like when I think back to how we were as cavemen or cavemen and women, is that we weren't at that top of the food chain then. We were, and if you imagine how we were, if you transplanted even humans from today without all the technology back into, say, the age of dinosaurs, we would be breakfast or lunch or, whatever else it is at that time, right? And so this is that type of world where the humans are not at the top of the food chain, where humans are struggling to survive. And so they're penned up in quite secure locations. So there's well, at the very top of the mountain would be one of them. At the top of a snowy mountain in a, safe in a temple with magical wards around you would be one location. Another would be, say, a crater. So one of the civilizations here lives within the walls of a crater. And another would be, say, in the middle of there's things as a lake island, so an island in the middle of the lake where the lake acts as a natural barrier to some of the predators around. And so that was a really fun kind of place to play. Another would be that I knew I needed to deliver a high stakes story.
Right.
I knew that I wanted, just like a Die Hard or a Lara Croft or any of those types, I knew I wanted that kind of lives are on the line, lives are dependent, the world is at stake, but something along those kind of epic lines. And then I've talked a little bit about mysteries and secrets and twists. And so that's the package that I really envisage, both the book I wanted to write, the book I love to read, but also the promise that I'm making to those readers in the action adventure, the unique world, the high stakes, and the mysteries.
Awesome. And still on the topic of your first book, this actually is a first fan question. What were some of the challenges you encountered with writing Perils of the Past, since this was your first manuscript, your first book?
So many. There's a lot of you remember from your movie, there's a lot of challenges in writing your first. The one that comes, I guess, first to mind would be the difficulty of knowing how close you are to finishing. Like in a race, let's say you're running 5,000 meters, 5K. I don't know what 3.62 miles for anyone that talks in miles. If you're running that type of race, right, you will know where the start line is, and you will know where the finish line is. And if you're wearing a running watch or you have some measure of distance, you will know where you are along the way. One of the challenges that I found in writing the book was just knowing where I was in that process. Like even when you finish a first draft, you're like, great, like the feeling of finishing a first draft after penning it for however long is incredible. But then you're like, oh, okay, you get those feelings about, is it any good, and how much work will it need, and how do I take this to the point that it needs to be? And after the fifth draft, I found that I was still asking myself the same questions. I was like, well, how many more drafts, Kane, do I need to finish this? I can see that it's improving, but I wasn't quite sure where that finish line was, and the finish line was at draft number 11. And I just hadn't quite realized that it would. Now, these aren't total rewrites, but these are, substantial edits where each time I think that, I've made massive improvements to the story. I've rearranged these sections. I've rewritten these chapters. I've fixed this plot hole. I've made this character, I've increased their depth and their emotional range, and I've got more variance in the pacing between these two sections, so that after a really, intense battle scene, you've got a little bit of a lull so you can catch your breath and kind of the characters can marinate in their feelings after the kind of the defeat they've just suffered before the next high. So I've, smoothed out the pacing and I've reorganized it. And then you kind of read it with fresh eyes the next week and you're like, oh, no, I've definitely got another draft and maybe another draft after that. And you kind of still feel the same way after the next draft. So that was what I felt in one of the difficulties, which is, I think, an inherent difficulty in writing and an inherent difficulty in being an artist in a way, is that, is there a point at which anything is ever finished? And I think you need to find that point for yourself when you're comfortable that it's as finished as it is with the talents and experience that you have at that time, and with as much confidence as you need to be able to release it. And so after draft number 11, I found that.
Awesome. And some more fan questions I think are really, really cool to ask. So let's start with the setting, the world. Again, you don't have to be as heavy with the spoilers. You want to keep those, for the reader. But when crafting the world of Perils of the Past, which did you find the most challenging? Writing the world that is gripping and immersive, or writing a world that appeals to the five senses? Or did you find some overlap with the two?
Definitely found some overlap. I think the most challenging part of the world building wasn't creating it. I found so much energy and enjoyment and excitement in the world building, and I've got author friends that will world build for a whole year, and they will
Mhm.
have so much fun, and then they will use 10% of that in the novel, or 5% of that, or whatever. So I enjoyed the world building part about making it gripping and relevant, and having I talked before about our place in society, and us versus nature and creatures, and I think it's one of the most exciting things about fantasy is just the scope and breadth of the world that you can create, and the variety. Right, you pick up
Mhm.
5 fantasy books, they're probably all set in different worlds. The difficulty that I found was actually trying to write it in a way that was quite natural for the reader, and slowly immerse them in that world,
Mm.
while not kind of drowning them in a whole bunch of different terminology they'd never heard before, in like info dumping. There's certainly, you got to hold yourself back from the desire to explain the world to the reader,
Mhm.
and to kind of dump them in it. I think I just wanted them to experience the world through the characters' eyes, but trying to do that in a natural manner is quite difficult. So Antana, my main character, who's featured on the cover and who's featured in the picture behind me, she already knows what a certain, a fly who has a certain name in the fantasy world. She already knows what that is. And so when it lands on her, she's not going to do a little, she's not going to think in her head about all of the particulars of this fly so the reader's going to understand it. She'll just use all of the words that is natural to her. And so
Mhm.
there's that little bit of tension between, you want to catch the reader up to some extent, and the characters already knowing everything. When a character visits a place they've already been before, they're not usually that immersed in that place. They're immersed in whatever emotions they're feeling going back to that place, maybe, or they're immersed in their to-do list when they get to that place. But
Mm.
they're not necessarily. And so I wanted to stay true to the characters and stay true to what they're thinking, but find a way to do that where it feels natural that you're exploring the world and explaining it. So that was the most challenging part as a debut author.
And on the topic of characters, how did you make them feel complex yet authentic? Because, we're always going to be inspired by characters from other works, other pieces of media. But even with the archetypes that we like in certain characters, they do have to be believable in their own story. So, in the case of your main character, how did you accomplish that?
They definitely do need to be believable. You're right. There's certain tensions. I had a really clear idea of Antana as a person, and she felt real to me, and she felt like she had her own personality, her own desires, her own wants and needs, her own backstory, her intentions. And so by fleshing her out in my mind as much as I could, in terms of what she'd been through, how she'd grown up, her circle of friends, her family, her religious beliefs, her way of thinking, her approach to problems, the more real that I could make her, the more that I could understand, the better that I understood her, the more that I could properly convey her in the novel. And so whether or not, there's various websites that recommend, interviewing your character. And then there's, questions and answer sheets for characters. There's books about how to tie in your backstory into your novel. And so, yeah, I drew on a number of different of those type of resources. But really, I kind of stayed true to my original image of Antana and the type of person that she is. So in Perils of the Past, the past in the title stands for a couple of different things, and it had takes different meanings as you go through the book. But one of them is reincarnation. And so Antana is struggling with, you meet her high on the temple. I've talked, it's on the cover. I've talked about the temple location on the top of a mountain. So the book opens with her on the top of this mountain, trying to find a way to connect more strongly with her past life. So in this one, reincarnation, the soul is from one person will be when they pass away. That soul will be, same soul will be carried over into your next life and will go into a different body. And so you've got one soul cycled through lifetimes. So that soul retains memories of its past lives. And so take, for example, the movie The Mummy. This is talking about how you draw inspiration from something that people love and then making it fresh again, right? So The Mummy, we had, Brendan Fraser, we had Rachel Weisz. So Brendan Fraser was playing Rick O'Connell, and Rachel Weisz was playing Evelyn O'Connell, the wife. Now, Evelyn O'Connell was a reincarnation of the Pharaoh's daughter. So that was, this is many lifetimes ago, obviously. This is back in ancient Egypt, verse, early 2000s, I think the movie's set in. And so she's a reincarnation of the Pharaoh's daughter, and the Pharaoh entrusted her back in, 100 lifetimes ago to protect the bracelet of Anubis. And then she's a very similar person, in the present day. And she has the same aim as she did in that past life, it turns out, to protect this bracelet. And then she's fighting against a reincarnation of the bad guy's wife. So it's the bad guy versus, Brendan Fraser, and the bad guy's wife versus Rachel Weisz, and with their reincarnations. And I always felt that I loved the movie, but I always had this inspiration of what would happen if your past life stood against everything that you believed in your current life.
Ooh, that is a pretty good dilemma.
And so what if when you're at the top of the mountain training in this temple, trying to, really keen to connect with your past self, what if you weren't happy with what you found there? What if you were completely distraught with what you found there? What if that one kind of took your life in a completely different direction and made you question your life choices, your beliefs, your history, and made you, do you hate yourself? Do you embrace your old self? Do you find a new path for your life? And so that's one of the things underlying it. It's not the primary plot. Like the primary plot, as I talked about, is she goes on a journey and adventure to find a cure to save everyone that she loves. So it's this quest for a cure. But underlying that is a secondary plot with the reincarnation about her past lives and the power and the truths that they hold.
Absolutely. Very, very true. So it's very clear to me, Kane, that you took a lot of time really fine-tuning and getting the story exactly the way you wanted it to be before you made the announcement that you were going to publish it. Now, before you told your followers and your readers and your ARC readers, beta readers, whoever was working with you with getting the book ready, what about your friends and family? What was their reaction when they learned that you were working on your first book?
In a word, it was probably like, oh, finally. Or it could have been, oh, again. So yeah, look, I'm really close with my I have one younger brother. He's about a year and a half under me, so we're quite close in age. And so yeah, really close with him. We were, when we were 15, we were, kicking the soccer ball about or playing table tennis or whatever, and I would be telling him, we would be throwing ideas around for stories that I would write. And that type of approach is, we're in our 30s now, and we're still doing the same type of thing, although I'm in Australia, in Sydney, and he's in Germany at the moment with his wife. But yeah, they were excited that I was finally gonna really do it, and that I was ready to commit to it. And they were, quite supportive, of course. My wife was supportive, my parents were supportive. So I know some authors that keep it their own little secret for a while. Again, if that works for them and helps them kind of have their own time with that manuscript or build up their confidence for it, that's very understandable. I found that I needed to share it with people that I was close with and I find that, if you share a goal with someone, they can help keep you on track. Like if you told 5 friends that you're going to run 5, I'm talking about running analogies today, apparently. You're going to tell 5 friends that you're going to run every day. When they see you tomorrow, they're going to be like, did you run today? Have you had your run? Are you going for your run? And then you're like, oh no, I'm too tired and sore. They'll be like, wait, whoa, what are you talking about? You just told me you're going to run every day. And so I found that in telling the close circle of people around me, it helped with my motivation and accountability, but it also, was a little bit of a conversation starter the next time that, I'd be chatting with my best friend or whatever else. They might ask about the writing, and that would also help kind of keep things flowing, keep the momentum.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this next set of questions I call reflective questions, and I think they are really important to talk about. So the first one is about, what it's like to be an author in today's digital age, because the industry has changed in the last 20 years. Being an indie author is much different than it was, again, 20 years ago. When we heard the term indie author, it was a belief that it was a lesser form of publication. But nowadays, you can't even tell the difference between a traditionally published book and an indie book unless by, of course, who is the publisher. But the quality has gotten better. It's such a great improvement. But with that said, again, industry has changed. And with it being, of course, the introduction of social media and the internet. And social media and internet are great tools for authors to use to build their following, to make a newsletter, and also to build a website. But it also is a double-edged sword because there are many instances of authors being at the mercy of hecklers, negativity, and all that stuff, which can be very detrimental to a person's overall well-being. And of course, imposter syndrome is always going to be there, and sometimes it can be heightened by the harsh reviews or the staunch critics. Everything like that could be contributors to this rise of anxiety. So for you, Kane, when you were on the road to publish your book earlier this year, did you have any moments of, heightened anxiety or imposter syndrome? And if so, or if not, what disciplined you to stick to your guns and say, you know what, whatever happens, happens. I love this story. This story has been with me for a long time, and I'm going to do what I have to really let people know why this story is this good.
Yeah, it's a really powerful question. So a couple of different aspects to that flow first to mind. I think that through the writing process and going draft after draft after draft, you build up more confidence. Certainly when I in my first draft, I was like, is it good? I really can't tell. But after you go through 10 or 11 drafts and you work with some amazing editors, I was really lucky to work with Sarah Chorn, Catherine Harris, Nathan Hall, just some really industry leading and just some lovely people. So just some amazing editors that you build up a level of confidence, but also with, an independent third party giving you their advice and opinions about what's working and not working and the overall strengths of the story. you build up some of that, as well as, you know, I was in writing groups and I had writing friends and acquaintances, and I know some authors, as you know, through you know, being online and through following their work and all the rest, and then connecting with them. I think that really helps. So that's part of it. Would be that I drew confidence from the process. I knew the steps that I'd followed and the path that I'd been. But the other side about imposter syndrome, yes, I think there were certainly moments where I doubted myself. There were moments where I was down and I was up and then I was down again. The first thing I did was that I reminded myself that that's very, very common. In fact, I think most of the authors that I follow have had points where, you know, they've released posts or videos or little clips or shorts or whatever it is, where they also, you know, and following author newsletters as well, where they've talked about, you know, how they've had a bad week, or how they've, you know, they've read, you know, something else and they've seen how someone did something and that they wish they'd done it like that. But then they remind themselves of, you know, that everyone will approach it differently and that there's strengths and weaknesses in each of those approaches, and they will get some lovely feedback the next day and they'll be back on cloud nine, right? So I think the first thing is just I reminded myself that this is a very common human experience, but especially an experience that authors and artists more generally will feel. The next thing was opening up about it. You know, I had monthly writing groups, and so there would be that little session at the start or the end where you would just share, you know, how you were going, whether you were up or down that day, how confident you were. And so that was useful in having kind of a forum to release some of that, especially like a safe space where you can just open up with people that know and can understand how you're feeling in that moment. I think another thing that was useful was that as much as I had kind of goals and timelines and ideas in my head, I wasn't rushing to produce this book in a set number of weeks, for example, or turn it round for I wasn't, you know, by indie publishing it, I had control. And so while I had a set publication date, I only set that when I knew that I could meet it. And so in the first kind of 4 years of writing, I didn't know that it was going to take 4 years, and I wasn't rushing to that point. I could be like, look, if the draft isn't bad, I'll just do another edit. If this draft isn't great, that's fine. Like, that's the purpose of a draft, right? Getting my ideas out there, and I'll rewrite this scene. I'll fix back and I'll go back. And so when I was having that imposter syndrome, it would just be, just a natural draft, Kane. It's a process of evolution. So I think not rushing it, and then also, you know, having the confidence that you've engaged the right editors that will help you kind of refine it would be another thing. Last two ones that I can think about would be that I think we have to all be careful about negative self-talk. I think it's easy to spiral, and if you can kind of catch yourself in that spiral before you go too deep and reframe some of that always helps. And then the last is I talked about support in the writing community with writing groups or writing friends, but I think more just general support, the support of your spouse or your significant other or your partner or your best friend or your parents or your kids or your, you know, whatever your support networks looks like for yourself. Definitely, you know, being able to lean on them or any of that is useful too. So that would be somewhat of a comprehensive answer, but that's yeah, all of the different points that I think about when I think about imposter syndrome.
All right. And this kind of goes into a more personal question because earlier in the interview, you mentioned that, you know, you began writing, starting this book initially when you were 16, and over the last 4 years or so, you fine-tuned it to where you wanted it. And of course, you published it this year. And the reason I bring this up, Kane, is I've talked to a lot of authors on the show, and I've seen a pattern where a majority of the indie authors that I've interviewed, a lot of them began their journey 4 or 5 years ago during the pandemic, during the COVID lockdown. And this has led me to the conclusion, or to this debate, that because of the lockdowns, it became a breeding pool for new authors and new talents everywhere in the publishing industry, whether that's new authors, artists, editors, and narrators. And this has sparked a debate of whether or not we are in a golden age or a renaissance, or rather an iron age or a new age. And I would like to hear your thoughts on this, coupled with also entering a new age, of course, which is AI entering the publishing industry. So, what are your thoughts on this? Are we in a new age or golden age? And what are your thoughts on AI entering the publishing industry?
I have a range of thoughts on this topic. It's very topical, of course. It's quite nuanced.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the what the big corporations are doing in, I don't want to use the word stealing, but maybe I find something slightly softer, but they're effectively misappropriating huge volumes of text to
Yeah.
and artwork to reproduce that in a setting. And I think that there are more appropriate ways that you can train your large language models rather than using things without consent, especially where some of that material is marked, not for AI use, where authors, if they were asked, would not consent, where there is no compensation flowing for that use. So I think there are some real dangers in the ways that certain big techs are approaching their training of large language models.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a worry. I know that various societies for authors have concerns. I know that there's various lawsuits on foot, especially in, say, the US. So it is a worry. At the same time, I think that readers are keen for books written by people that they can connect with as a person. Like, I think
Mm-hmm.
that I'm not worried about AI taking over our creativity or replacing human authors, because I think that as part of that natural, like, the stories that we've grown up with throughout humanity is a way to impart lessons and truth. And when we're sitting around that campfire hearing this story, there was a deeper kernel sitting behind that. There was a reason that they were telling that story. And so I think there's something deeply human about making art and telling stories and connecting to other people. And I'm not worried about that core being replaced. I do think that magazines that receive submissions have struggled in certain contexts where their volumes have doubled, and where they are trying to filter out what is an AI story versus a human story versus a story where the humans put half. They've taken an AI story and rewritten it, which is something I'm not interested in at all. I enjoy the creativity part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the publishing industry is changing and struggling in certain contexts, booming in others. I think that the rise of TikTok over the last 3-4 years, and the way that that has worked really well for certain authors, especially in certain genres, and has been quite interesting. But that's not necessarily new. Not when you compare, before that it was, say, Instagram or Facebook or whatever else it was, and I don't think those have been replaced either. So I think it's a complex environment at the moment, where, as you say, the impact of social media, the impact of AI, the rise of, self-publishing has been growing, as you said, for the last 20 years, and it's
Yes.
continuing to grow. It's interesting about audiobooks too, and the share of, say, the audiobook market versus the ebook market versus the paperback and hardcover. And it's an ever-changing landscape at the moment. So it's an interesting industry to be a part of, and I really enjoying connecting with fellow authors and talking about it, but I'm not sure that there's any easy label I would put on this current time. It's quite turbulent.
All right. That is very true. That is very, very true, Kane. Thank you for that answer. That's probably the most thought-provoking answer I've had on the show for that question. So thank you for that. And on the topic of the publishing industry, that leads into the next segment, which is my favorite, the business side of being an author. And as a little fun icebreaker question, what was the most surprising aspect you discovered about the publishing industry when you launched Perils of the Past? And going back before you began, releasing it, is there anything you would have done differently in terms of the launch of Perils of the Past?
Great question. So I was really fortunate to have some amazing support on launch day. I was blown away by how engaged people were on Twitter and Threads and Blue Sky, and anyway, all of the Insta and all of the different social media platforms. So launch day was a real highlight. Launch day was a real highlight. So that was not necessarily surprising, but it was. I mean, the extent of it was that I felt really supported on that, and that was lovely. What I would do differently is I avoided social media for a large extent for, I don't know, 15 years. I had a Facebook account. I was very late to Insta. I was late to, most of the other platforms. I mean, I've been on them a couple of years now, but I wish I had started not in my, early 30s, but I wish I had started in my early 20s or in my teens or in my, whatever. So yes, if I could go back 10 years, I would have got further into that book. I would have got earlier into the book community. I think there's some great spaces and some fantastic people on each of the different platforms and in each of the different areas. And I think you talked before about some bad players and some bad actors on social media and some negativity. That does exist. But if you find your tribe, if you find the right kind of circles to dwell in those places and find the right people to connect with, those people that are, loving the same type of books as you, that are expressing a similar type of energy, then I would have loved to get involved in that at an earlier point in time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And going forward, another thing to talk about is, of course, the audience of each book, because the audience is very important. But, after doing the show now for about 6-7 years, I've come to the conclusion that marketing to your target audience may not be the end all be all, at least from the authors that I've interviewed. Some have argued that it's best to market to your readership, as long as you have a good idea of your readership, whether that's, YA, middle grade, new adult, and adult fiction. So for you, Kane, as you were crafting Perils of the Past during the drafting phase, did you have a good idea of your audience? And when you launched your book earlier this year, did you market it towards the audience in the preferred genres that you were writing in, or did you market to a specific readers like yourself?
Yes. So again, I guess a couple of different things come to mind. The difficulty and both the enjoyment here is that I don't find that the target audience for Perils of the Past is really, it's not a super niche, it's not super narrow, but it's also at the same extent not really broad. And so it's not a YA, so I'm not clearly marketing it to like 16 to 20 or something. There's no specific age room. I think that the book is suitable for either males or females. So I'm talking kind of males or females 18 to what. I'm not sure that I want to cap an age limit. I'm not. And so I'm more interested in, instead of trying to narrow down a gender and or an age, I was more after people that enjoy certain types of books and that enjoy that kind of focus. So I know that I'm kind of trying to target people that like fast-paced books, that like books with sword fights or magic or action. I know that I want also people that enjoy that adventure, those I talked about how she goes on a desperate journey, right? I know that I'm after that type of a reader. And so, for example, if though you grew up loving The Hobbit, then that again, that's kind of like, oh, okay, perfect. That's kind of the reader that I'm after there. And then so we've got the action adventure with as a side of it, and the pacing. I think it's also worth understanding what you're not targeting. So this book has very little romance. Romance is maybe 2% of it, like 1%. Like it's a very tiny part. And if you're after a strong romantic subplot, or if you're after a romantasy, or you're after any of those types, that's not. There are those readers, and I think it's important for everyone to find what they love to read. But that's not the type of reader that I'm trying to attract with Perils of the Past, unless they also enjoy, they read that type of book and then they also enjoy an action adventure. So I knew action, adventure, low romance. And then it was about finding similar kind of books. And so I talked about The Art of Prophecy. I talked about In the Shadow of Lightning. I've mentioned The Hobbit, I guess, 2 or 3 times now. But then, so there's those type of books, and then also the type of movies. So I've mentioned The Mummy. Other ones would be like a Lara Croft with Angelina Jolie, the Die Hards, the Blades, all those type of ones that I grew up with, as well as similar environments of what they're looking for. So again, if you're after urban fantasy where you're in a more natural setting, again, that's for readers of particular taste, but that's not what this one is. I talked about how this has a unique world, and so it was adding all of those elements up to attract readers with that kind of interest. And it's a challenge in marketing where you're trying to find readers with those tastes, but not with those tastes, right? And so, yeah, it's been challenging. I don't know if I've done it well or not well. I think a little bit in between. But yeah, it was about really clear messaging in the marketing about this is the book that I've created. This is a book that if you like these things, you will enjoy this book. And then messaging, finding different ways to package that up, whether or not it's through author interviews like this, whether or not it's through the media graphics with the arrows and the little words around it, the little graphic, of whether or not it's about a trope type marketing image, whether or not it's if you like this, you'll like that. And so finding different ways to convey the message of the book and why, as well as finding also ways to convey that really clearly in the blurb, on the cover, in the title, like all of the full package of the book. You just need to be able to convey that really clearly. So I'm learning. That's certainly the process of releasing a debut, right? You learn what works and what doesn't, and sometimes you're not sure. Sometimes it's a little difficult. You're like, did that message land? I think it did, but it's where you try and get some feedback from your readership or from your people that about whether or not you conveyed yourself as clearly, or you can tweak that messaging. And I think there's always tweaks to be made.
Absolutely. Very, very true. And I think you touch on another topic, which is, of course, writing the book that you want to write, which boils down to the voice of the author. But I definitely feel even with that in mind, you do have to understand the genre that you're writing in, because for each genre, there's a certain expectation. And there's this fine line of individuality where you don't want to be too new that it completely throws the reader off, but you don't want to be a carbon copy of a book that already exists. It's this fine balancing act. So for you, Kane, could you go more in detail about how you were able to balance the two, your individuality as an author, how you approach storytelling, but also being mindful of the genre that you're writing in, as well as the possible expectations you may have for a type of story like this?
Yeah. Right. So the first part of that is that I read 90% fantasy for the last, however many years, right? And so I understood my expectations of the readers within that genre and my own expectations. And so I wrote to those. The next part would be that I read a number of craft books and that talk about the different, storytelling techniques and the reader's expectations of plot and structure. And so that was quite interesting. And so I had, I guess, building blocks. At the same time, I know that readers of epic fantasy novels enjoy the creativity. And so I wasn't afraid to lean into my more creative sides and bring them a fresh world, bring them unique beasts, bring them an interesting magic system. And all of those make it feel fresh and new and novel. And if you have, I talked about layered characters with deep backstory and twists on different plots that you've seen before, or taking the reincarnation in the mummy and then flipping it on its head, right? I wasn't afraid to bring them something a little different, knowing that that's actually what many fantasy readers appreciate. Now, you're still meeting their expectations when you're giving them sword fights and magic duels and an epic quest, and when you're giving them the type of kind of progression throughout the novel that they're experiencing. But I'd like to think that while it takes inspiration from all the books that I've read and all the movies that I've watched and all the stories that I've heard and all the things that I've experienced, it is a fresh take with as much originality as I can pack in it, with those type of twists about, taking inspiration from a Matthew Riley book about how, someone you think the main character is going to die, surely they're going to die, they've just been shot, and then next chapter they're still alive, and you've got that surprise reveal. And so taking that kind of element and then inserting it into my own fantasy novel where there's no guns, where there's no type of technology, and finding out how I can save that main character, taking I don't know, for example, a Die Hard where, Bruce Willis starts the movie wearing a suit, probably not a tie though, if it's Bruce Willis, but starts the movie in a suit, it's looking all dapper, and by the end of the movie is like got threads of cloth hanging over him, he's covered in blood and dirt, and he's just killed 20 guys, right? You can take that kind of inspiration of a character gradually getting, more wounded, gradually getting, worn down, injured, and at the end of it standing triumphant, right? That's a very high level that's been done in across countless movies and books, and then inserting that type of an element in yours, and it will still feel it will feel somewhat familiar in a sense, but when you've got your unique world, your unique magic system, and a really rich, deep characters, then it will feel still fresh and inventive, especially where you've packed it with as much inventive things as you can, where humans aren't at the top of the food chain, where the magic system is, has those unique elements too that bring a fresh take to the magic fight. So yeah, I wasn't afraid to lean into that creativity and bring something fresh, knowing what I knew about the genre and what I knew that epic fantasy readers love.
Absolutely. Very, very true, Kane. And we're almost near the end of this amazing author interview. There are a few last questions left. But before I get to that, there was something I did want to hear your thoughts on. Early in the interview, you said that, Perils of the Past is a standalone book. It's not going to be the beginning of a series. And I think that is a very, very, not, I don't say proud, but very, like a very firm stance to make, especially with people saying like, oh, this needs to be a series, this needs to be, the world's so good. And that's always a good thing for an author to hear, but it's a very 50% chance of like, if I write a sequel, will the sequel live up, or will it be like, a case of sequelitis where it's not as good as the first book? So for you, Kane, how did you make the decision that, or I shouldn't say, when did you make the decision to say that Perils of the Past was going to be a standalone book, and the ending that people are going to read is the definitive ending, but also make it a satisfying ending to where they're not wanting more in the sense of more books like in this universe, but possibly more similar books, like the types of books that you've mentioned in the interview.
Yeah, so by it's a standalone read, what I mean by that is that the key arcs end where me as an author and as a reader want them to arc, and it is a complete story, knowing, however, that a book set over 3 months, for example, for the character, whichever or however many of the characters survive, they've still got another 30, 40, 50 years, however many years to live. And so I want to wrap up the arcs. I want to, when I've been teasing you for 5 chapters with a mystery, or 10 times throughout a book with a clue, I want to give those clues. I want to give those answers. I want to tell you whether or not she finds a cure. I want to tell you whether or not that cure is effective. I want to know whether or not, she makes it. I want to know how she wraps up with her past life. Does that end well? Does it end not well? Does she find the answers that she wants? Does that bring her peace and clarity, or does that, send her spiraling? And also, that's Antana. Then we've got my mage Cal, my mage Zeth, and then we've got my seer Cal. And so we've got those 3 characters: the warrior, seer, and the mage. And each of those, I want those arcs to end at an appropriate point in time, and for it to feel satisfying, as you said. So yes, there's that part of it, but I know that their lives continue on to some extent, and I want to hint at what those might be. The standalone decision was that there's so many fantastic series, and I love them, but I do enjoy a standalone in between those series. Like sometimes I just feel like I just want to pick up a book that I can read by itself. And so, for example, The Will of the Many, I'm going to contrast 2 books here. The Will of the Many is brilliant. But I read the ending and I'm like, please give me book 2 right now. Like right now, I need book 2. Because the ending of The Will of the Many is fantastic, but it's also throws a number of questions that leave you almost insatiable for the answer. And I needed to follow that book I couldn't follow that book with another series. I needed to, after I'd finished that, I was like, I need something that gives me all the answers that I feel like in one book, and where I don't have the commitment or the weight or the whatever else it is for the next ones. And so as a reader, I sometimes enjoy whether or not it's a palate cleanse, or whether or not it's just to read a complete story without the needing to read another 5, that I enjoy reading the occasional standalone. That doesn't, so I always thought that, say, for example, The Black Tongue Thief was a standalone, or there's a number of others. Kings of the Wild would be another one. And so there are novels where they've either written those, where they've written prequel novels, where they've then taken it on but written them in 50 years time or whatever else. So I might return to the world. There are parts of this I've only explored, in one book, there's only, and with a fully fleshed out world, there's only so many parts of the world that I've explored. So I'm certainly not opposed to returning to the world. It's possible. I don't know that I like the chances, but it's possible that I might return to some or all of these characters.
All right.
Cal had about 25% of the book. And so, yeah, it's possible that I could pick up with him in the future. But this book is intended to, you read it, and it's intended to deliver an ending that wraps up, the core questions that I've asked. Might not necessarily be every single question, but all of the core questions. That's what I've intended to wrap up within this book. So yeah, that's what I mean.
Absolutely, Kane. Absolutely. And I think that is very, very true. Reading a book in a series is amazing, but I definitely agree with you're saying that whenever we read a book and the ending is like, okay, where's the next book, and you read it and it's like, okay, where's the next book, and then follow up, it's like you're never going to be satisfied, there is that feeling when you read a really good book that just, not part of a series, or at the very least, it's a break in a much larger series. It is a palate cleanser in the sense of it's familiar, but it's something different than what you are typically used to. And now there is the next question. And this one's more of a scenario. It's probably a little fun one. So, context for this question, we've talked about a lot of things in this interview about being an author. But I think the most important thing to note is that in this industry, it's not a get rich quick scheme. It is a lot of grinding, it is a lot of hard work and dedication. And the harsh truth of the matter is, there is no guarantee the book is going to be an overnight success. Harsh words to say, but this industry has stated that there are some exceptions to that rule. And if your goals are right, you'll be fine. Because ultimately, there are two paths for authors: to be known as an author and to be an author. One is dedicated to the craft, that is to be an author. To be known as an author is an individual dedicated to the marketing aspect. And there are so many talks, so many workshops about, what it takes to be an author. So I pose this scenario to you, Kane. Let's say that you've been invited to host a panel, or you've been invited to give your own discussions of what it is to be an author. And in the audience are numerous aspiring young authors, poets, maybe some screenwriters, maybe some script writers, and of the plethora of topics to discuss with them about, what it is to be an author or how to be an author in this industry. What is the one topic you would like to discuss with them that would also be a pearl of wisdom to them?
Great. So I would probably pick the topic about if we look at my writing career, it's 4 years in writing and half a year this for Perils, 4 years in writing and half a year in production. So I'd probably stick to something I'm more familiar with. I think it would be quite intimidating to stand up and talk about how to successfully market a book, as opposed to someone who's written 20 books and release them. So I'd focus on the writing part. I think what I would focus on especially is finding what works for you. We've talked about this before in the individuality of the creative process and experience, but I would think about how I found where I sat on the plotter versus pantser line. I would think about, I talked before about rearranging my mornings and my evenings to find an optimal working time, so that I'm, can bring my best self and my most, creativity, so that I can tap into that appropriately. I'd be thinking about where to write, whether or not are you writing on the train on your way to work? Are you writing at home in the desk? What happens when you get stuck? I think that's a really interesting, in every author interview where someone's asking, what happens when you get writer's block or when you get stuck? I think that's a really interesting thing to explore, and whether or not that's, as simple as someone taking a shower, going for a walk, doing the dishes, whether or not that's, they immerse themselves back into something creative where they read a book, they watch a movie, they listen to a song, they take a complete break. Do they put it in the drawer for 2 days and then come back to it with something fresh, or do they kind of keep at it? I think I'd explore that topic with them and really encourage them to find what works best. Whether in all of those settings, what works best for you in plotting or in not plotting, in just sitting down and writing, what works best for them in when they write, how they write, where they write, what they do when they get stuck, who they rely on. I think that's what I would explore.
Awesome, Kane. Awesome. And as a final ending to this incredible interview, here's the last fan question. With everything said and done, what do you want readers to take away from not just Perils of the Past, but your other stories, your flash fiction, your short stories? What do you want readers to take away from your written word?
Love this question. So I would answer it in two parts. The first part is that I really enjoy reading, and I especially enjoy reading fantasy and action novels for the escapism. for where you are immersed in another world, where you're reading this book and it is playing this, maybe it's playing like a cinematic movie in your mind, maybe it's teleported you there. And so I hope my book provides some measure of escapism and enjoyment from that. There are within that, though, deeper themes that I would like to think that I've explored, and deeper meanings about whether or not, the extent to which, you can overcome adversity and overcome your past, for example, and how you approach things about, tenacity or racism, or anyway, there are deeper themes built in that I have taken the time to explore, but they're more subtle. I'm not trying to beat you over the head with any of those. In the first instance, it's truly a book about, escapism and enjoyment, about, following these characters on an epic adventure as they face, beasts and traitors and tyrants. That's the type of book that I'm trying to provide to the readers.
Awesome, Kane. Awesome. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude another amazing, incredible author interview on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. A huge thank you to Mr. Kane Williams for making his debut on the show. We wish him the very best with the successful launch and all the success that comes to Perils of the Past. Now, Kane, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out, as well as buy a copy or two of your book? And do you have any special shout outs you want to give?
Yes, I would love to. So the best place, we'll start with that. It has the links to the various platforms to purchase the book on, whether or not it's an ebook, the hardcover, which I will hold up, or the paperback. It's available in all three formats. It would be my website, which also has all of my social media links. It has my newsletter. Anyway, all of that. So the website is kanew.au. That's it, nice and simple, kanew.au. And as for shout outs, I would like to shout out the editors that I mentioned before, Sarah Chorn, Catherine Harris, and Nathan Hall. I would like to give a especially big shout out to my cover designer, so Anderson from Design Unlikely. And if you follow the magazine Story Unlikely, which is run by Dan, it's a fantastic magazine. That's their sister company there. So definitely a huge shout out to my artist. My cover reveal was handed by the one and only Patrick Leo. So Patrick is a huge influence on my writing and my reading. He's a fantastic YouTuber, and so yeah, big shout out to Patrick, who did the cover reveal back in January for Perils. And I might, so I could keep going on for another 10 minutes with shout outs, but I might stop it there. Thanks so much for today, Gabriel.
No problem, Kane. And make sure to follow all those people down below, as well as check out Kane's official website to order yourself a copy of Perils of the Past. And as always, viewers and listeners, thank you again for joining us for another amazing episode. Like, comment, and subscribe down below to stay up to date with all new episodes coming out later this week and the next week's following. And until next time, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you all in the next episode.